Am I louder now? There we go. So not a whole lot to mention. Some things I'll mention kind of later on, logistically, kind of about assignments, things like that later on in the class. You should see on Canvas now. I put up an announcement about this. So you can still see your original exam grade. I've got it up here in the ungraded assignments with that first poll we took like day one, just to kind of get an idea about when people could attend CL sessions. Excuse me. What's now counting towards your grade is this midterm exam number 1 curve. So this was kind of the curve where you got back 0.2 of the points on every question you missed. Let's see, I think I've got one other thing I wanted to mention before we kind of jump into material. So I showed you this hypothetical grade tool. Right now, we only have one exam, right? So it's kind of being underweighted because the exams don't end up being just kind of 20%. They end up being 66% of your overall grade. So I told you could play around with the midterm and the final exam scores to see what your final hypothetical grade would be in the class. You can also kind of do worst case scenario, right? So I didn't want to do this before the curve grades were out, but let's say this person does the exact same on the next 2 exams. You can kind of think about this is what your kind of current grade actually is if you continue the same exact performance on that exam. So if you want to give yourself kind of a worst case scenario, you would kind of change those 2 exam scores to be whatever your kind of current midterm is, and that would kind of give you worst case scenario. Now, obviously, so again, I mentioned this on Tuesday, but if you do better, right, that's just going to start to increase your grade more and more, okay? Now, also these categories, right, what do I do at the end of the semester? Drop your 2 lowest quizzes, 4 lowest in-class quizzes, and then your lowest module readings, right? So that's not reflected on Canvas yet until the end of the semester. So right now, if you want kind of your worst case scenario, if you keep on missing the same amount of assignments, in-class quizzes, et cetera, you get the exact same performance on that first exam on the next 2, that would kind of be your worst case scenario. And then obviously you can kind of play around with different hypothetical values, okay? If you have any questions about using this, feel free to kind of reach out to me. I can kind of give you a better idea kind of what you would need if you're having difficulties with this, if math, isn't really your thing. So other than that, we'll kind of jump in right where we left off, which was talking about price floors, right? So any questions before we jump into material here? Okay, so I kind of drew this out for us already, and we talked about price floors really work the exact same way as price ceilings, just everything's kind of the opposite, all right? So we said if we start out in equilibrium, right, what would A, B, and E represent? So the shape on top, not the most technical way of remembering this, but it represents consumer surplus. It's the area below demand, which represents consumers, and above the price they pay. It's kind of like we can think about consumer surplus as the consumer's net benefit. We said the area down here, C, D, and F, would represent producer surplus, right? The price for them is the benefit, their marginal cost represented by the supply curve. So we said, where does a price floor need to be in order to be effective? Above the equilibrium. It doesn't allow that price to get down to what the equilibrium should be. So if we've got this price floor, what's going to happen to the new quantity in the market? It's going to go down, right? Any of these price controls that we've talked about, price floors, price ceilings, we'll talk about more later today, they're going to decrease the quantity. So what's dictating that with a price floor? Well, it's the fact that because there's this higher price, quantity demanded won't go past wherever that price ceiling hits our demand curve. So what is our new consumer surplus? It's the area on top or below our demand curve, but above that new price. So kind of area A would represent consumer surplus, okay? We kind of drew this out last class. I'm just kind of reviewing it a little bit. Now, the quantity demanded is going to dictate what the new quantity in the market is, but what at this higher price are suppliers or producers going to want to supply more or less than before? More. So quantity supplied at this higher price is greater than the quantity demanded, so we have now a surplus, right? So unlike a price ceiling, we had a shortage. Right? Now, if I'm thinking about producer surplus, area on the bottom, it'll be the area below that new price, but above our supply curve, but only up to the last unit that someone's willing to buy, or this new quantity after the price floor. So we've seen now, producer surplus used to be this entire triangle, CD, and I think this was F. We lost F, but what did producers gain? Area B, which used to be consumer surplus. So with these price floors, we get a transfer not from producers to consumers, but from consumers to producers. And you think about why? Well, the price is higher. Who is that a good thing for? Producers, right? And so that's what we end up seeing, okay? Now, the area of E and F, we said represents what? Deadweight loss, or the loss of surplus from the fact that none of these units are being purchased and sold on the market, right? So that's where our deadweight loss comes from. So that was kind of what we ended with last class, just kind of reviewing that. I think I drew it out for us as opposed to having it on the slides. Now, if I'm calculating areas, we can do this just like we did for price ceilings. We're just finding the area of shapes. So here, what would my consumer surplus be before? Well, it's the area below demand, but above that equilibrium price of 50. So I'd have what? The height of that triangle is 40. The base is 40. 40 times 40 times a half would be 800, right? Now, after this price ceiling, what is my consumer surplus? Represented by what color? Blue, right? It's the area above the price, but below our demand curve. Once again, just the area of a triangle, but it's now smaller, right? We can see that consumers lost all of this surplus after the price floor. So once again, what's the height? 30, base is 30, 30 times a half. We can see that consumer surplus is decreased, okay? Now, what was producer surplus before? Just taking the colors away to kind of help. Well, the equilibrium price was 50, so it would just be this triangle on the bottom, the area below the equilibrium price, but above our supply curve. So numbers are kind of nice here, 40 times a half. We actually have a scenario here where consumer and producer surplus started out exactly the same. That won't always be the case, but I kind of did it here to kind of show what's happening, right? So if after I have this price ceiling, what is color represents producer surplus? Green, the area below the price that they're able to charge, but above their marginal cost or above the supply curve. So now we have a little more work to do. We've got a rectangle and a triangle, right? So 20 times 30 is the area of our rectangle, 600. 30 times a half, so that would be what? 450. So 450 plus, what did I say? 600, so 1,050, right? So we can see here after this price floor, consumer surplus went down, producer surplus went up, okay? Now, if we add these values up, what was total surplus before? 1,600. What is total surplus after? 15. So what was deadweight loss? 100. Now we can also look at this and say, well, we know the deadweight loss was all of the surplus that we used to see in this market, but the quantity is now lower. These units are no longer being purchased and sold. So this red area would represent deadweight loss. Hopefully, if we calculate the area of this triangle, we get 100, right? Sure enough, 20 times 30 minus 40 is 10 times a half gives us that same value of 100, right? So we can look at deadweight loss in the graph, or we can kind of compare what was total surplus before and after, okay? Any questions over anything here? I'm getting a lot of correct responses from the questions, so that's good, right? So this is kind of what we focused on last class, kind of remembering price controls. The price floor needs to be, it's kind of counterintuitive. The price floor needs to be above the equilibrium price, and the price ceiling needs to be below, okay? So this is where sometimes we have some results that are counterintuitive. This would kind of be one of them, okay? We'll talk more about minimum wage. I kind of set this up, the example I gave you last class, in the context of the labor market. If we have time today, we'll revisit it, all right? It's going to work the exact same way. Minimum wage is just a price floor in the market for labor, right? Now, if we have time, so we talked about what's happening if I have a price floor. My quantity is going down. So if the quantity of labor goes down, that is unemployment, right? So we just kind of looked at a very specific market, the labor market, and the minimum wage is a good example of a price floor we actually see the government use, okay? So we'll revisit this, right? So $15 minimum wage, we'd have unemployment everywhere, right? If we have time, we'll kind of come back to this market, talk about efficiency wages. It's something that I'm not going to quiz you on or you wouldn't see on the exam, but I think it's an interesting thing that we can kind of use some of the topics we've talked about and kind of apply it to like these real world scenarios, okay? So we'll revisit this if we have time. Now, I'm going to got this slide here. I'm going to draw this out for us here real quick and kind of mention some things. And I might focus less on this when I'm asking you questions on the quiz, but it is a control that the government has. So instead of using price controls, right, let's say we had this market and it was in equilibrium, right? So we should hopefully get kind of good at drawing these. Supply is equal to demand right here. Here's our initial equilibrium. Supply, we said, represents what? Yeah, if I'm drawing these out, I'd start adding these in because they help us start to think about what consumer producer surplus is. So supply represents marginal cost to producers. Demand represents marginal benefit to consumers. This is where it's not a cumulative, like the next exam will just be over these kind of next 4 weeks, but we're using things we've already talked about. So instead of using price ceilings and price floors, let's assume that the government comes in and just says, we don't like, what did a price floor and ceiling do? It did what to quantity? Decreased it. Well, we have another way of decreasing it, and it's kind of weird because usually when you think of quotas, they'll talk about like businesses have quotas, like the workers have to produce a certain number, like you have to at least produce 500. When the government imposes a quota on something, it's really a limitation. We're only going to allow this many units into the country. Usually it's kind of thinking about taking things from overseas, but this could be any market we could impose a quota. So if we impose this quota, right, well, what do we know is definitely going to happen? If we don't allow the quantity to go past this point, quantity in the market is going to go down, right? So this is kind of our quantity after the quota. Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky, because at this quantity, we know that consumers would be willing to pay whatever their marginal benefit is, and producers would be willing to accept whatever their marginal cost. So we know for sure, let's just say in the market, that consumers had a lot of power. They're going to be able to kind of get producers down to their lowest possible point, which would be whatever their marginal cost is. So we know that the worst case scenario, we would have producer surplus being right here. Now, if producers have a lot of power, which is most often the case, they can kind of force consumers, right? If there's a lot of consumers and they all want this good, we would now have a lower quantity. We know there's going to be a high competition for whatever this is. This is also like a company, if they do like a special release, they're not the government, but they're putting like a quota on themselves. If that company knows they have a lot of power and consumers are going to like really want this good, so they're going to be willing to pay all the way up to whatever their marginal benefit is, producers would be able to get the price to be at its highest point, whatever that last consumer is willing to pay. So we know for sure consumer surplus could be here. Now, this area in the middle is really like, this is why I don't ask questions about producer-consumer surplus on quotas, because it really matters who has more power. If producers have more power and they can get the price to be up here after the quota, what would producer surplus be? The area below price, but above our supply curve? Often, producers have more power in the market. That's just the way it is, right? There's fewer of them, more of us. So there's more competition amongst consumers to buy this product. Producers kind of rely on that. And we typically see with a quota, that price is going to end up a lot closer to that consumer's last marginal benefit. Now, it could be the case if consumers have more power, they can kind of force the price to be, we can kind of think about like, here's the consumer, if they had more power, they could push the price down to here, in which case, what is producer surplus? It's just that lower triangle, and consumers would get all of this. So that kind of rectangle in the middle is going to be surplus that with a quota, we really don't know, right? It kind of depends on what market we're looking at, who has more power. Now, we know someone's going to get that surplus. We just don't know if it's producers or consumers. So what I have in the slide shows you an example of when producers have more power and we get that price to be higher. That's often the case. But when it comes to quotas, really what I want you to focus on is just that we're going to end up with a lower quantity. So what do I know for sure I'm going to have in this market? Dead weight loss, right? So I might ask you to identify like dead weight loss from a quota. There, it's the exact same way we're doing it with price ceilings and floors. It's just all that surplus, the area between supply and demand, that would represent kind of consumer and producer or total surplus, that we lost because we've reduced the quantity. Okay? Any questions on this idea? I know I'm being a little bit vague here, but like I said, I really can't ask you about producer-consumer surplus when it comes to quotas because we'd need to know more about that specific market. Okay? But what I could ask you about them is, what is the deadweight loss that's created, and what happens to quantity. And there, it's really the same effects of a price floor and ceiling. It's just instead of changing the price, we're changing the quantity. Okay? Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay? So, next thing that we're going to talk about, primarily most of the class, is going to be about taxes today. We'll talk about subsidies at the end, but for right now, we're going to really focus on taxes. So why does the government tax you? Because they want money to pay, hopefully, for things that benefit society. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week when we talk about positive and negative externalities. But the idea is, we see taxes everywhere. If you've ever worked a job, you've paid taxes, right? Income taxes are kind of our main one we think about. But when you go to the store, what do you always have to pay? Sales tax, right? There's also specific taxes, which we would call kind of like excise taxes, that are put on specific goods. So these excise taxes might be, there's a specific tax on tobacco products or on gasoline, or these other examples that we see kind of the government impose a specific tax on. What's kind of a tax that's been in the news lately? They don't call it a tax, but tariffs, right? On certain products coming from overseas. It's essentially just taxing a specific good. They just call it something that sounds a little bit kinder, right? And we'll talk about why we might want to tax specific goods more than others, right? We'll kind of see the implications of taxes, and I think it'll be a little more obvious why we're choosing tobacco, alcohol, these things to put additional taxes on. Tax incidence, right? When we have a tax, before we go into it, it's going to push us away from the equilibrium. So we know what's going to be created. Deadweight loss. Some of that loss is going to come from producers. Some of it's going to come from consumers. Who bears more of the burden of a tax? We're going to call tax incidence, right? So tax incidence is just a fancy word of who was hurt more by this tax. Who bore more of the burden of that tax being imposed, okay? So a very easy example to think about taxes, and then we'll look at it in the context of our market. Let's say I was going to go out and get a used car and I was going to pay $11,000, right? That's how much I have in my pocket to be able to buy this car. That's the highest possible, it's my marginal benefit. That's the most I'm willing to pay. Matt is willing to sell this car for $10,000. So is the car going to get sold? Yeah, there's a range. They could actually have to bargain in between 10 and 11,000. They're okay with any price in that range. If it was 10,500, well, Matt's okay with that. He would have sold it for 10,000. David is okay with that. He would have paid 11. So we've got this range where we know that this transaction will occur. Now, what if there's a 15%? I did this to make the numbers nice. This isn't in reality. But let's say there's a 15% tax on used cars for whatever reason. What's the value of the tax? Let's say they agree on the price of 10,000. Matt's feeling kind. He was willing to take 10,000. He's going to help out this other person. Will the transaction still occur? Well, what is kind of the value, right, of, oh, hold on. I have a typo here, right? Must have been typing fast. There we go. That makes a little more sense, right? So what is the amount of tax you would pay on a $10,000 car if it was 15%? Well, 10,000 times 15%, you'd have 1,500, right? So now if David buys the car for 10,000, he's got to pay this additional tax. What's the total amount he's paid? 11,500. Is he willing to pay that much? No, he was only willing to pay 11,000. So even if Matt tries to kind of make sure this transaction occurs and takes his lowest possible price, what's now going to occur because of this tax? The transaction doesn't occur, right? So if the transaction doesn't occur, what's going to happen to the equilibrium quantity in the market? Well, if it would have been sold before, after the tax it won't be, quantity in the market is going to go. If it happened before and it no longer happens, the quantity is going to be lower, right? Taxes stop this transaction from occurring, okay? So this is just a very basic, like one-on-one person example where taxes are going to do what? Lower the quantity we see in the market, okay? So let's think about why, right? So we can impose a tax on two individuals. So I'll draw this out and we'll kind of come back to the slides. I think sometimes seeing me build these out helps you be able to reproduce these. So people have been coming to my office asking for help reviewing old exam questions. I said, the piece of advice I've been giving everyone, every review problem, practice exam, practice questions, quizzes, even if you get the right answer, you might have just got lucky. You might have guessed. You might not really be thinking about the question correctly. You should be able to produce a graph or use some type of equation to lead you to what the correct answer actually is or support why. So if we think about taxes, let's say we have a market and it's in equilibrium. All right, so we've got our supply curve, which represents our marginal costs, our demand curve, which represents our marginal benefits. And we start out, here's kind of our initial equilibrium price and quantity. Okay. When I tax producers of a good, so this is an easier way to think about it, and then we'll switch to consumers. If I tax someone who's making something, what have I essentially done? Whatever the cost was to produce that good before, the cost is now higher. It's whatever it was before. Now I've also got to pay this additional cost of a tax. So at every quantity, what's going to happen if supply represents my marginal costs have went up, right? So it's almost like we've seen, so costs are going to be higher, but what would this look like? So if supply goes to the left, it looks like a decrease in supply. So our supply curve plus the tax, and we kind of talked about this in things that would shift supply and demand. If we tax producers, we said that would decrease supply. The reasoning behind why is because it increases their costs, okay? So what's the new quantity in the market after this tax? Down here, right? So what's happened to my equilibrium quantity after a tax? It's went down. What have I created because of that? Every unit in this range, what would surplus have been before if they had been sold in this market? This triangle here, so this would represent a loss of surplus is deadweight loss. So just like price ceilings and price floors, taxes are going to create a lower quantity in the market and create some deadweight loss. Okay? Now, unlike kind of price ceilings, price floors, it's a little bit trickier to think about, okay, what is producer and consumer surplus after, right, we have this tax? Okay? So where is the new equilibrium price? It's not the equilibrium price, but it's the price after this tax, right? The equilibrium would be if the government wasn't involved. What would the new price be after this tax? Well, where is my new supply curve equal to the demand curve? Right here. So producers are now no longer willing to accept anything less than that value. So that becomes the new price in the market, or generally I'll kind of say this is the price in that market after the tax. So what is producer surplus? What is consumer surplus? It's the area on top, right? So the area, what's consumers, below the demand curve, but what is their cost? The new price they have to pay. So our consumer surplus will now be this kind of smaller triangle on top compared to if there was no tax. So with a tax on producers, who has been hurt? Actually, consumers, right? Producers pass off that tax burden onto our consumers. Now, what is producer surplus? This gets a little bit weird. You would think, oh, it's just the area below price and above my supply curve, right? But how much money am I actually keeping when I sell this product for this higher price? Let's say I'm selling it for $50, but the tax I have to pay to the government on that was 10. How much is the producer actually keeping? 40, right? So we'll kind of think about this price up here. This is the price that the consumer is going to pay after the tax. How much do the sellers get to keep? That amount. Well, what's the difference between my supply curve and my supply curve with the tax? That difference is just the value of the tax, right? That was the cost added to producers. So if this is the amount paid, in my example, $50, if the tax was $10, what's the price that sellers keep? So it would be the price consumers pay minus the value of that tax. So the point that producers, or we can kind of think about suppliers here, get to keep after the tax is actually going to be down here. So what is producer surplus? The area below the price they get to keep, but above that supply curve. So what has happened to producer surplus with a tax? it's now lower as well, right? So we've seen with a tax, producers and consumers will be hurt. Another way to think about this is the price that a consumer pays after the tax will be equal to whatever the price the seller gets to keep plus, my T's look like pluses here, but plus the value of the tax, right? If the consumer pays $50, the tax is 10, the producers or suppliers only get to keep 40, right? So if you wanted to kind of put those numbers there to kind of think about it, right? Because there's now a tax, the consumers will pay this higher price, but sellers only get to keep whatever the consumer hands over to them, and then they have to take out the tax and pay the government. Okay? So is all of this deadweight loss? Well, it gets kind of weird because now we have another party involved, the government. Where does this tax money go to? The government. So we now have not producer and consumer surplus, we have government surplus, if you want to think about it that way. Now, here we'll usually don't call it government surplus. We will usually kind of reference it as tax revenue, right? Like that, it's what it is. It's a positive amount of revenue or a positive surplus the government is getting. How much money, if I'm thinking about total revenue coming from a tax, what is that going to be? So for every unit that's sold after the tax, how much revenue is the government getting? Whatever the value of the tax is, right? That's the amount of money going to the government for every single unit. So the number of units after the tax times the value of the tax tells us what that total revenue that was generated for the government. Well, what is the height of this rectangle? What's the difference between the price the consumer pays and the price the seller keeps? So if I just do a little bit of algebra here, the price the consumer pays minus the price the seller keeps, that's just the value of the tax, right? So the height of this rectangle, didn't leave myself a lot of room, but that's going to be the value of the tax. What's the base of this rectangle? Goes from 0 to the quantity sold after the tax. So that's exactly representing government revenue, or another way we'll kind of reference this is just tax revenue, okay? So we still have that deadweight loss. We did have that correct, right? It's just that now we've got not only producer and consumer surplus, we have government surplus, or tax revenues could be considered, considered as well, okay? Any questions on this before we keep moving? Yeah. What do you mean, eat the costs? I mean, we could dive into that, but basically they're just going to be doing what? Costing themselves even more money. So why would they do that?
To still have the same market share. Because might only be a 6-month thing.
So I mean, we could complicate the model and build in like future periods, right? We're kind of thinking about one snapshot in time here. So yeah, if you wanted to start shifting even more things, I could do that. It's just going to become a much more complicated question. But even then, right, if every firm has that incentive, what would happen? If they all eat the costs, some of them are going to go out of business. It would actually be a pretty poor decision by those companies, right? Because their cost is going to be higher. So if they accept a lower amount, why wouldn't they have accepted a lower amount before the tax just to gain more market share? Well, they didn't do that because gaining more market share by having lower revenues to show to my shareholders, they don't care if I'm selling more if I'm making no money, right? So they wouldn't do that, right? But I understand your thought process, right? All right. Any other questions on that before we keep moving here? Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit more about tax incidents here in a second, once we understand a little more of like just dive into things deeper. But how would I determine who has a larger tax incidence? Would be, I would have to compare my consumer surplus before to my consumer surplus after, producer surplus before to my producer surplus after. Whichever difference is larger, that's the person or the group that lost more surplus. So they would be bearing more of that burden. So I would actually need some numbers to be able to determine that here. So in fact, It's a good question, right? So if I finish this up, we'll get there, I promise, right? So here we had a market in equilibrium. I chose taxes as the good. Let's say we have a tax on cigarettes. Consumer surplus before and after. Hopefully this is looking pretty familiar. We've talked about this a lot already on Tuesday in today's class. Consumer surplus, area below demand, above price. Producer surplus, area above the supply curve but below the price. After this tax, we said, what is that shift, or what is that difference between the supply curve and the supply curve after the tax? Well, the firm's marginal costs went up by whatever the value of that tax is. Now, for us, the only taxes we're going to focus on to make it easier, we could complicate it, but we're just going to think about per unit taxes. If we start to do like percentages based off of price, it gets a little, just math just gets trickier. So here we're just thinking about a flat rate on every unit. This is the amount of tax you have to pay. The same implications, like the same logic and directional changes would occur. It just becomes more complicated mathematically if we were to do like percent changes or percentage taxes as opposed to just like a specific amount. So here we're just assuming, I've got this $1 tax. That difference between my supply curve and my supply curve with the tax would just be $1. Okay? So we said, what happens? Well, that's going to raise the price that the buyers have to pay. That's that new equilibrium price of the good in that market. But the sellers don't get to keep this. When the consumer pays $4.50, the sellers only get to keep what? The value of the tax is $1. They only get to keep $3.50. Now, why would going down to the old supply curve tell me that value of $3.50? Because what's the difference between these supply curve and the supply curve with the tax? The value of the tax. Right? So that difference between the price the consumer pays and the seller keeps will always be that value of the tax. Okay. Excuse me. We then kind of identified consumer surplus, right? Was the area above the price the consumer pays, below their demand curve. Producer surplus, area below the price they get to keep, but above the supply curve. We then said this area in the middle represents what? Tax revenue. Once again, tax revenue will always be, what will the height of that triangle always be? It will always be the difference between the supply curve and the supply curve with the tax. So the height will always be the value of the tax. The base will always be the quantity after the tax. That's why it's always going to represent tax revenue. Now, it doesn't quite have, so we talked about this red area represents what? Deadweight loss, right? It was the loss of surplus from the fact that we're no longer at that equilibrium quantity, we're somewhere lower. What's the height of that triangle always going to be? The value of the tax. What's the base of that triangle always going to be? How many fewer units that we're selling or seeing, sorry, I shouldn't say that we're selling, that we're seeing purchased and sold in the market, to be more technical. That'll always be the case. So if you take the value of the tax, the number of units that you see that market reduced by, that would always give you deadweight loss. Now, we have linear demand and supply curves, so it's going to be that times 1/2 because it's a triangle, right? We have these kind of downward sloping curves. But that will always be the height and the base of your triangle there. Okay. Now, this is an interesting one. You can look at the surplus values, but if I kind of look at how much more did the consumers pay after this tax? 50 cents. How much less did the suppliers keep? So the tax incidence here would be equitable or even. So you don't even have to calculate the producer and consumer surplus. You could, but you can also just look at what was the difference in the prices that these two groups paid. Whoever has the largest difference, they're bearing more of the burden. Okay. In fact, I'll draw something out here in a little bit that shows you an extreme example of this to really make that point. But for now, we'll kind of keep it there, just thinking about who had that larger change in prices. Now, what if we have a tax not on producers, but on consumers? This is all going to work kind of similar, but something gets flipped, right? So if I tax consumers, what's going to shift? We're looking at consumers' demand. If I tax consumers, let's say my marginal benefit from buying this thing before was 100, I have to now pay a tax of 10. What's my new marginal benefit? So it was 100, but now I have to pay an additional $10 to get it, so my real marginal benefit is only 90. So what's happened at every quantity? My marginal benefit, if I want to buy this good, is going to be whatever it was before minus the tax. So we're going to see a decrease in demand, right? So here was our market before, same example we had before, just to kind of keep the numbers consistent. But now I'm going to see a decrease in demand by that same value of the tax, just like I saw an increase in, not an increase in supply, but an increase in marginal costs, which are essentially a decrease in supply. It's going to be the same difference, whatever the value of that tax is. But now, what's the new price in the market after this tax? It's going to be where my new demand curve hits my supply curve. So now the new price in the market will be down here. Okay? So this is where it gets a little bit harder to think about with consumers. If I have a tax on consumers, when I go into the store, like if you go to the store and you have to pay a sales tax, when you pay that amount of, let's say the sticker price on a good was $5. Well, when you go to buy it, you would pay $5 still. That goes directly to the supplier or producer. But then you also have to pay whatever the sales tax is. It shows up on the receipt, but it never goes to the producer. It automatically goes to the government. So whatever the new price in the market is, when we've taxed consumers, this will be the sticker price or the price the sellers get to keep, but you have to give the seller that $5, and then you also have to give the government, in this example, $1 sales tax. So what's the price that consumers actually pay? It would be whatever that price the seller is willing to sell that good for, plus you have to pay that tax to the government now. So we still end up with the same two prices, right? The price the seller gets to keep is still going to be lower than before, and the price the consumer, the total price the consumer pays, it's now going to be higher. It doesn't change what those prices are. It just changes who's giving the money to the government, right? Who's handing it over. But in terms of the actual surplus loss to both groups, it'll be exactly the same. It doesn't matter if we tax producers or consumers. If we notice here, after this tax, what's consumer surplus? The area below demand, but the new price consumers pay. What's producer surplus? The area below the price that they get to keep above the supply curve. All of this money in between, the value of the tax times the quantity after the tax, would be government revenue. So we have the exact same impacts in this market, whether or not, as long as it's the same value tax, here it was $1 tax to either one. If we tax producers or consumers, we get the exact same impacts. Also, we get the exact same impacts on tax incidence. Who was hurt more by this tax? They both, consumers paid 50 cents more. Producers kept 50 cents less. They were sharing the burden equally, right? So it doesn't matter who we tax, consumers or producers, we get the same impacts, okay? And we get the same values for the price the sellers keep, the price that the buyers have to pay, same tax revenue, and also the same, what's not on the graph yet? Yeah, what did we lose here? Same deadweight loss, okay? So we can do either way, right? It doesn't change the impact of this tax, okay? Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? Now, if I'm thinking about this in a broader scope, right? If I'm the government, what is politically more attractive to tax, consumers or producers? Well, producers, I guess technically they do have a vote, right? But there's way more consumers who vote than producers. So what do we tend to see? Taxes on producers, right? Now, a sales tax is kind of like a sneaky consumer tax. But politically, if we increase the sales tax too much, people are going to get very upset. That would cost those politicians a lot of votes. So we tend to see the government like to use these producer taxes, but does it matter? Nope. Has the exact same impact, right? It's just they can kind of pass it off as, oh, we're taxing producers. We're helping you guys out. Well, what do the producers do? All that happens is that additional tax cost gets passed on to the buyers anyways. So it doesn't really matter, right? So tax on consumers, tax on producers, same exact impacts, okay? Excuse me. I'll go through this kind of quick. You could probably even piece this together based off of what we've talked about. But before a tax, what was consumer surplus? This triangle on top, area between price and demand, A, B, and E. Well, we looked at this a lot in other examples already. Consumer surplus, C, D, and F. After we see a tax imposed, the new price that consumers pay, here, let me see if I get I don't have my supply curve in here. I'll give you one here real quick just to make it easier to see. So let's just, for the sake, it doesn't matter if we tax producers or consumers, which is why I didn't want to include one on here. But I think based off of what we talked about, oh, this might make a little more, oh, come on. There you go. That's the one I want. So let's say we did tax producers, right? And here's kind of my new price that the consumer will pay after the tax. The seller, they get that amount of money, but they have to pay the government whatever the tax is, so they have to keep a lower amount, okay? So in this example, where is my consumer surplus? The area below the demand curve, but above the new price they pay. So they've went from area A, B, and I think this was E, to just area A. They've lost all of this surplus. Producers, their surplus is the area below the new price they get to keep, or the amount of money they get to keep, but above their supply curve with the original kind of marginal costs. So they've went from area, what was it? C, D, and F to only area D. So both consumer and producer surplus went down. What was the area in the middle here? We said that was tax revenue. So part of tax revenue, area B, was coming from who? It used to be consumer surplus. Area C is now tax revenue that's coming from producer surplus. So part of tax revenue will be from consumers, part will be from producers. Who is paying more of that? That's what we're talking about with tax incidence. So if we actually had some, grid lines here and could calculate which one of these was larger, whichever one is larger, that's who's going to bear more of the burden of this tax. Right? Now, what would area E and F be? That's our deadweight loss. So not only will part of tax revenue come from consumers and producers, but just like with price ceilings and price floors, part of our deadweight loss, some of it comes from producers, that would be area F. Some of it comes from what used to be consumer surplus, that would be area E. Okay? So now instead of a transfer of surplus from producers to consumers or vice versa, like with our price ceilings and floors, now the transfer of surplus is going from producers and consumers to the government. Okay? So that kind of area in the middle there, B and C, that's going to be our tax revenue, and it comes from two different sources, right? Our producers and consumers. Okay? Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? And I could have drawn in a decrease in demand. It would have the exact same impacts, right? We said it doesn't matter who I tax. Okay? So the next thing that we're going to talk about, right? And I kind of already alluded to this because you asked questions. You're thinking ahead of what I'm even at right now. Is I can look at the prices and determine who has more of the burden of this tax by simply looking at the difference between the new price that that group is either going to keep or pay, depending on if we're talking about producers or consumers, and the old equilibrium price. So whichever group, if I look at consumers, if the increase in the price they pay compared to the old equilibrium, if that difference is larger than the difference between the lower price sellers keep and the old equilibrium, then we would say consumers bear more of the burden. If that difference is greater for producers, we would say that producers are bearing more of the burden of this tax. Okay? So that's a kind of an easier way, I think, of identifying tax incidence. We'll go through and calculate surplus and show that it would show us the exact same thing. But for right now, we can just think of that tax incidence. Who has that larger change in the price from the old equilibrium to their group's new price after the tax? Okay. Any questions on this? All right. So here I had an example. It's a little bit different, right? And I've thrown some numbers in here. We'll work through some more examples, so I won't go through it as detailed as I did our previous models. But we've got a tax on who here? The supply curve shifted, so our tax is on producers. It raised the price from the old equilibrium of $1.50 to the new price consumers pay will be what? $2.25. So what's that difference in the price consumers pay and the old equilibrium price? 75 cents. If I then go down to my supply curve to figure out, okay, consumers paid $2.25, but if the value of the tax was $1, this is kind of the same dollar tax that we had before, what does the seller get to keep? I hand them $2.25 and they have to give $1 to the government, they only have now in their pocket $1.25. So the price that the seller gets to keep is now $1.25 compared to the old equilibrium of $1.50. So how much less are they getting to keep? 25 cents. Who's bearing more of the burden of this tax? Consumers, right? So we can simply look at these differences in prices to determine who's bearing more of the burden, okay? Any questions on this idea? Just putting some different numbers where we didn't have equitable distribution of or incidence of this tax, where it's one group is going to be bearing more of the burden. So we can also tie tax incidence to elasticities, right? So I think this result is somewhat intuitive. And I'll draw out kind of an example where it's the extreme to kind of think about the reason why. So let's say let's just think through the intuition, then I'll draw a model for you. So I'll kind of start drawing it just to save time. But if I've got a market, right? If I'm thinking about elasticity, what did the tax do? It changed the what for both groups? Quantity of the market, but for both groups, they're going to either pay or keep a different price. So a change in price, the response from consumers and the response from producers is called elasticity, right? So whoever is more elastic, right, they're going to be more responsive to this change in the market caused by the tax or that price change. If I'm more responsive to something, can I avoid it easier? Or I'll give you an example. If I'm walking on campus and someone comes barreling down on one of these dumb electric scooters, right? If I see it and I don't respond, what happens? I bear a lot of burden, right? If I respond a lot and get out of the way, how much burden did I bear? So if I'm really responsive or I'm more elastic, right, I'm going to be the person that can avoid the burden of that tax, right? So whoever is more elastic, well, they're going to bear less of the burden, right? They can avoid the burden of that tax, right? So what would be the most most elastic I could be as a consumer? If I was perfectly elastic, what would that look like? Horizontal demand curve, right? So let's just assume suppliers are somewhat elastic. Consumers are perfectly elastic. So what group do we know is more elastic here? If they're perfectly elastic, consumers have to be more elastic than suppliers or producers. So what's going to happen? Now, this is kind of a weird one because what was consumer surplus technically before? What's the price in the market? Right here. So what was consumer surplus? What's the difference between price and demand? Zero. But we'll kind of show that their surplus isn't going to change from that. So they're not going to have any change in their surplus, or they're not going to bear any of the burden of this tax. If I have a tax on producers, what's going to happen? Supply is going to decrease, right? If we think about before, here was kind of our old equilibrium quantity. Where is our quantity after the tax? It's going to be down here. What is the new consumer surplus? Zero. So did consumer surplus change at all because of the tax? No, right? What about producers? What was producer surplus before? The area below price, but above my supply curve? What is producer surplus after? The area below the price, right? But after the tax, this will be the new price that consumers pay. What's the price that sellers get to keep? That amount minus the tax that they have to hand over to the government. So the new price that sellers get to keep is now going to be lower. So where is producer surplus now? This area here. All of the surplus that was like lost by producers, part of it is going to be, what would this area represent? Deadweight loss. But then the only other surplus lost, this is now going to represent what? Tax revenue. But notice all of the surplus that was lost here came from who? Producers, or they were the one that were more inelastic. Consumers didn't bear any of the burden. Now, this is an extreme example, right? It gets kind of a little bit weird to think about because consumer surplus, it didn't change, but it was always zero, right? But the same thing would apply if you just start to like barely draw like a very slight downward sloping demand curve. You would see that the loss to consumers is going to be really, really small, and the loss to producers is going to be much larger, right? Because it's not synonymous in terms of the values, but a very flat curve is going to be very elastic, okay? Any questions on this idea before we keep moving here? Yeah.
There, I understand it's perfectly right, but would there be a consumer surplus? Like, would we drive a surplus for an example like this?
Nope. Consumer surplus is zero in both cases. Yep. Okay. All right. Any other questions before we keep moving here? That was an extreme example. But you know, if we're just looking at numbers, right? So let's say I had something like this, right? If the elasticity of demand is 3.9, I can actually calculate these values. The elasticity of supply is 1.7. Who is more elastic here? The more elastic is the higher number. Now, both supply and demand in this case are above 1, so they are both elastic. It doesn't matter. It's whoever is more elastic. So if consumers are more elastic, who is going to bear less of the burden? Consumers, which means who's going to bear more of the burden? Producers. Now, if I have another example, right? In fact, I could change this just to make the point. Oh, sure. Let's say I had something like this. Well, make it larger so we can actually see it, right? So in this example, I've got supply and demand are both what? Inelastic, right? But who is more elastic? Once again, it's whoever has a higher elasticity measure. So here, who's more elastic? Producers. So who would bear more of the burden of this tax? If I'm more responsive, I can avoid the burden. Think about my dumb scooter example, right? If there was like, even if you don't just about me, like we have two people, whoever is more responsive, I can throw the other person in front of it, right? And they're going to bear all of the burden. So it doesn't matter if we're both inelastic. Whoever is more elastic, they avoid the burden. So suppliers or producers can avoid the burden, which means who's going to bear more of it? Our consumers. Okay? Any questions on this idea of kind of elasticity and who's bearing more of the burden of this tax? Okay? So I have another example. I'll go through it kind of quick. This is just another extreme example. Let's say I had perfectly inelastic demand. So when it was perfectly elastic, we said who bore the entire burden? Producers, right? Consumers were so responsive, they avoided all of the burden. Now here, it's kind of weird to think about because what is consumer surplus? What's the area above? So if we go back here, above the old price, equilibrium price, but below the demand curve, it would actually be like this entire rectangle. If we have perfectly inelastic demand, when there's a tax, the new price the consumer pays is up here. So before the tax, what was producer surplus? Well, the old equilibrium price was here, so it was just this lower triangle. After the tax, price the consumer pays is up here. The price the seller keeps is still whatever that old equilibrium price is. So producers are going to have the exact same producer surplus, so they didn't bear any of the burden. If consumers are perfectly inelastic, they don't respond at all, they're going to bear the entire burden. So this new price consumers pay, it's up here. My new consumer surplus is going to be this rectangle. All of that consumer surplus that we saw before is going to be lost and paid to the government. Okay? So this kind of rectangle in the middle represents after the tax. Well, what is it? It's the value of the tax times the quantity after the tax. That's just tax revenue. But it all came from consumers, right? Producer surplus stayed exactly the same because the price that they kind of got to keep didn't change at all if demand was perfectly inelastic. Now, is anything truly perfectly inelastic? Probably not, right? But kind of these extreme scenarios let us start to think about what direction this is going to change. Okay. Also, just something to point out here. What is interesting with a perfectly inelastic demand curve? If I tax that good, what happened to the quantity in the market? So what's deadweight loss? If the quantity didn't change, we said deadweight loss is coming from the fact that we are seeing fewer units purchased and sold. But if that didn't change, deadweight loss is 0. When people don't respond to price changes, if I tax that good, they keep buying the same amount. I'm just taking more of their surplus, right? So I can actually get a lot of tax revenue and create no deadweight loss, okay? If consumers or producers are very inelastic. Okay? So these extremes, a little bit weird to think about, but it kind of hammers home the point that when we have a very, very, very inelastic group, they bear the entire most of the burden. If they're very, very elastic, they can avoid the majority of the burden. Okay. Where are we at in time? Okay. What do I want to do here? So let's say I have this tax example, but I give you some grid lines, right? And this kind of goes to your question earlier. So what was the equilibrium price before the tax? Where supply is equal to demand, just 50. Right? So once again, if I want to find producer and consumer surplus before the tax, I think this was the exact same graph I showed you earlier. We're just finding the area above the equilibrium price, below demand, below the price, above supply. We would have 800 for both of these. Now, if I impose this tax, why is consumer surplus 450? Well, after this tax, the new price that the consumer pays will be 60. So the difference between the price they pay and the demand curve is this much smaller triangle. 30 is the height, 30 is the base, 30 times a half gives us 450. So how much did consumer surplus go down by? 350? No, 250, right? If I'm looking at this correct. Now, what was the change in the price that they paid? They went from 50 to now having to pay, so $10. Now, when they paid 60, what's the value of the tax in this example? Should be the vertical difference between my supply curve and my supply curve plus the tax, right? If it's all the supply curve plus the tax, it's the old supply curve plus the tax. So the difference, vertical difference between them is the value of the tax. So my tax here was $20. So the consumer pays 60, they hand over 20 to the government, the seller only gets to keep 40. So what's my new producer surplus? The area below the price that they get to keep, but above my supply curve. So 30 times a half. How much did producer surplus go down by? 250 as well. So who's bearing the more of the burden in this tax? They're bearing it equally. Now I can look at consumer surplus and producer surplus changes. What could I also look at here to see that they're bearing the burden equally? The difference between the equilibrium price and the new price consumers pay and the new price sellers keep. So we said already the consumers pay how much more after the tax? $10. How much less do the sellers keep? $10. That also lets us know they're bearing the burden of this tax equally. Okay. Any other questions on this before? Yeah. Not unless 800 minus 450. I don't have a calculator on me, but I think it's 250. Oh, it is definitely 350. Sorry, you're right. It's 350. I'm looking at this. Sorry. Yes, the difference between 800 and 450 is going to be 350. Sorry. Yep. Any other questions just on that idea of the tax incidence here? Okay. So what if I wanted tax revenue, right? How would I calculate that? It's the value of the tax, which we said was 20. What's the new quantity after the tax? 30. So tax revenue is simply 20 times 30, or that green shaded area. That's what should give us 600. Right? So I was thinking 6 for some instances. Sorry. So we've got our tax. What's deadweight loss? Well, once again, similar to our price ceiling, price floor example, what was consumer producer surplus, total surplus before was 1,600. What is the total kind of surplus after? It's not 900, right? If I add producer and consumer surplus, that's 900. But what do I now also have to add in? Tax revenue. So 900 plus 600 gives me 15. We have deadweight loss of 100. Hopefully, if I calculate the area of this red triangle, 20 times 10 times a half, I get that same value of deadweight loss of 100. Okay? Any other questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. Okay. So let's now think about the relationship of tax revenue and deadweight loss. Okay. So we've talked about tax incidence. Now we want to think about what is the government's goal of a tax? They want to try to raise the most money possible, right? But if I increase the tax, what am I going to start to do? Okay. In the most extreme example, let's say I had a market that looked like this. If I impose a large enough tax, what's my tax revenue from this? 0. Why? Because there's no intersection. The intersection would be below 0. Nothing is sold in this market. So as I increase the tax, yes, initially I start to increase the tax revenue, but what am I creating more of? Yeah, a higher and higher tax is pushing that quantity closer and closer to 0. So there's going to be this trade-off between generating more tax revenue, but also generating more deadweight loss. Okay. So if I think about kind of the size of the tax, right, and I'll kind of give you some examples. And for us, it'll be difficult to say like what the actual optimal size is without doing more complicated math that's outside the scope of what we want to do in this class. But let's say I have a really small tax, right? And I kind of think about, okay, here's its impact on the price. Here would be my tax revenue and the corresponding deadweight loss. So I've generated like a small amount of tax revenue because even though there's still a large quantity in the market, if I take a large quantity and I multiply it by a tax of a penny, it's not going to be a lot of revenue. Now, a small tax, even though it doesn't generate a lot of revenue, also creates a pretty small deadweight loss. Well, what happens if I increase the size of that tax, right? Well, now it looks like, okay, maybe tax revenue has went up. If I compare the size of those rectangles, it looks like this one might be larger, but what is definitely larger compared to the smaller tax? Deadweight loss. The more loss I'm creating in a market, what do you think I'm doing to people in my country? Pissing them off. And if they're voting, they probably don't want to vote for me, right? So there's always this trade-off for the government of, yeah, maybe I can generate more tax revenue if I increase the taxes slightly. But if I create more deadweight loss, politically, that's a bad thing, right? So there's always this trade-off between increasing the size of the tax. Now, there gets to be a point where it makes no sense for the government to impose large taxes. Because notice here, if I go from a moderate tax to a large tax, well, what is my tax revenue now? Very, very small, right? But what have I done to deadweight loss? Huge deadweight loss. So there's kind of this like inverse relationship. Initially, as I increase the size of the tax, I'm increasing my tax revenue, but I'm also increasing deadweight loss. Now there gets to be a size of the tax where then it starts to decrease tax revenue, but still increase deadweight loss. So would it ever make sense to get to that point? No, right? Now, what's the actual optimal size of a tax? Like I said, a little bit more, you'd have to start taking some derivatives of these equations. It gets to be a little bit more tricky. We're not going to dive into that. But here we want to understand this trade-off of, as I increase the size of a tax, I'm increasing potentially tax revenue, but I'm creating more deadweight loss. And then there would come a point, in my most extreme case, if I had a large enough tax, what was my tax revenue? 0, right? So kind of thinking about the use of these taxes and why the government just does like put huge taxes on everything, right? Because they wouldn't even generate that much tax revenue and they're creating deadweight loss. They've created 2 problems now, okay? So here's just kind of a summary of some of the things that we've talked about. We talked about comparing total welfare before and after a tax. We talked about tax incidence. We've talked about this idea of kind of deadweight loss. I didn't tie this to elasticity. I'm going to avoid kind of that topic, but this idea of how large the tax is, if people were really responsive, even a small tax could potentially not generate a lot of tax revenue, because even the smallest tax, people respond a lot, and they go to a quantity of 0, I might not be able to generate much tax revenue. Right? And then we talked about that relationship between deadweight loss and taxes, or sorry, deadweight loss and tax revenues based on the size of the tax. Okay? So I have an example here. Where are we at on time? So I might kind of hold off on this. And we didn't get to subsidies today. Usually, this is something sometimes, depending on how quickly we go through Tuesday's class, I don't have time for subsidies. So we'll start subsidies on Tuesday's class. On the quiz, I'll post it a little bit later today because I'm going to go in and there was like a question on the end about subsidies. I'm going to put the correct answer in the question. So read it carefully and you should all get it correct, right? If I see someone get it wrong, it means they either weren't here listening to what I'm saying now or they didn't read the question, because I'm going to bold it and put it in the question so you will get that last question about subsidies correct, okay? So we'll start with that on Tuesday's class. I've still got some stuff to get through here though. So I think we'll end with this if we have time, but I want to make sure that we have time to kind of get through this quiz, and then I will also mention something else. So we've got, what time is it? So we want to do $10:50 here. Oh, I wanted to also publish it. So we'll publish this. So this is on the home page now, kind of under that modules 5, 6 category. Kind of take a look at it, okay? All right, so we'll go through these kind of quickly, but I think based off of what we talked about, it's not too bad. So if I have a tax here, first of all, I told you the value of the tax. How could you find what that value is? Simply look at the difference between what? The supply curve and the supply curve plus the tax. So that vertical difference, you could look at any point. The ones where I put dashed lines are probably easier. That difference is 70 to 45. So the value of my tax would be, if I'm doing math correct now, would be what? 25, right? So I told you the value, but if this is a question on like the quiz, you might just be told there's a tax, you could determine what that value is. Okay? So what is the price that sellers get to keep after this tax? So the new price in the market will be what? Where the new supply curve hits the demand curve, so at 70. But what do sellers get to keep? When the consumer hands over $70, 25 of it has to go to the government. They only get to keep, we go down here, 45. So that difference between the price the seller keeps and the supply curve, that would represent our producer surplus, right? So if I take that, would be what? 35 times 35 times a half. So anyone wants to help me out, I could do this here. Is it working for anybody? No? Well, all right. So pay attention to me, and maybe I'll kind of have this posted so that you can work on it after class. Is it working for anybody? Just be honest with me. So we've got some people it's working for, but about half okay. All right, I'll send an email after class to let them know I'm not happy about it. So if I do 35 times 35 times a half, that gives me what? That's $612.50. So if you aren't able to get on right now, once again, I'll change the due date so you can get on after class and get it completed. I'll probably have it set to be due by the end of the day. We should have the answers though, okay? So make sure you're writing these down if you can't get logged onto Wi-Fi. What if I have this same market? What would my tax revenue be? So we always know that the tax revenue is that rectangle in the middle, but I said the tax revenue is always the value of the tax, which we've already said is what? 25 times what? The quantity after the tax. So what is the quantity after the tax? 35. So we would do what? 35 times 25. Checking my math now because I don't trust myself, which would be 875. Now we don't multiply by half here because it's the area of a rectangle. Or total tax revenue is simply the quantity that we sell times the value of the tax. Okay? So those ones shouldn't be too bad. What's the deadweight loss that's generated in this market? It's going to be the triangle on what side of this graph? The right side, right? It represented what? The surplus loss from both producers and consumers. So the area between our supply and demand curve for every unit that we no longer see sold in the market. So that's going to be all of these units between 35 and 50. We lost all of this surplus. So I said the height of this would always be what? The value of the tax, so 25. The base is always going to be what? How many fewer units we see after the tax. So it went down by 15. So we've got what? 25 times 15 times 1/2. All right, checking our math there would be $187.50. Okay. Now for this subsidy one, we didn't kind of get through this today. So instead of wasting time, because I want to mention something else, don't worry about mentioning this one. I'm going to go in after the fact and just change the weighting of these problems so it only scores the first 3 questions. So you only have to respond to the first 3 questions here. I'll kind of update it after the due date. So like I said, I'll have it set to be the end of the day today. Tomorrow I'll go in and change the scores. So don't panic. You know, tomorrow I'll have these updated so that it kind of reflects. I'm only going to count you for these first 3, which we covered today. Okay? Any questions? I need to take the next few minutes here that we have to tell you about something else related to the course. Are we all understanding because of the Wi-Fi hiccup what's going on with the in-class quiz? I'm just going to change the due date literally after class to be the end of the day. You can go on. If you were in class, you should have the answers, and you only have to answer those first 3 questions. I'll update the scores tomorrow. Okay, so we're not quite done. I need to take the next 3 minutes. You're going to want to listen to this, okay? So the next class or Canvas discussion I've now got published. So it's going to be related to minimum wages and employment. Okay. So I've got it set to be due the end of the week next week. So the end of the day next Friday. All right. So you've got a little more than a week to kind of work on this. Some common mistakes in the first one you need to make sure you're doing. Right. You need to have an initial post to this prompt that I give you. Okay. I give you 3 different links. I mentioned I kind of summarized the articles. You don't have to read these. If you're interested, you can kind of go deeper into them. I kind of summarize them, give you some potential topics, questions to think about. Once again, you don't have to answer every question, but try to at least focus on a couple of them and kind of give your responses or thoughts about the impacts of minimum wages on employment. So it's going to discuss some things that kind of go against what we talked about in class with the minimum wage on Tuesday's class. But I'm trying to get you to think harder about why maybe even if we saw minimum wages go up and unemployment actually went up, why that could still coincide with the results that we talked about from our models. So I try to lead you to kind of some of the conclusions by what I've said. Now I also ask you at the end, okay, so I ask you at the end, I give you a data source just like the first one. So in your initial prompt, you need to open this link. There are a bunch of tables at the bottom. They show you different statistics about unemployment rates, minimum wages, and by different categories. So like this one looks at, what do we want? We can do by educational attainment, right? It kind of breaks down kind of how many workers were at or below minimum wage, kind of what our percent of each one of these groups is, and any kind of statement you're making or whatever your response is, try to find something, and that last paragraph I think has some questions that can help you think about this with the tables. Use something from one of these tables to either support a statement you made or a question you answered, right? You need to specifically mention which table you accessed. So this one I would say the educational attainment or wages and salary workers. There's other ones where it's demographic breakdowns of like age and why won't it go back for me? Age and like sex and right? Talk about what table you accessed, mention some of the statistics that support whatever statement or kind of questions you answered. That's your initial post worth 10 points. You then need to respond to 2 students each response earning the additional 5 points for a total of 20 points for the assignment, okay? So every one of these Canvas discussions will kind of follow that same thing. The data just varies, okay? So you've got that, should be easy points. You're worried about your grade. This is a way you can guarantee you get 100% of the points in that Canvas discussion category by simply going on, putting a little bit of time, have a thoughtful response, and get those full 20 points, okay? Other than that, you guys are free to go. Have a fun, safe weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday.